Okay, session 2, here we go. Woo woo. Last week it was the canon and text, and we got through the canon part. We didn't get really too much through the text, so we're going to do that today. By text, I'm talking about both Greek, original text, and English translation. So we'll try to cover all, not all, but that gamut of topics tonight. There's a lot that can say, and I'll try not to get too distracted or into any particular part of it, because the textual criticism I really have always found quite fascinating. So just a couple of points to remind you why we would talk about this is because we do not have what are called the original autographs of the actual books of the New Testament. We don't have what Matthew wrote. We don't have what Mark had. We don't have Paul's letters. We have copies of them. A lot of them from very early in history. In fact, the chart we used last week was this one that compared similar types of literature in both in that time frame and looking at the number of manuscripts we have and how long between the time of the event and the first early copy of a manuscript. So for instance, we don't have any original manuscripts that Caesar wrote, but we have copies. We have 10 copies of some of Caesar's writings that the earliest copy we have is 1,000 years, dates 1,000 years after Caesar. That's a pretty significant amount of time, but 10 documents, that age of document, that isn't so crazy. The most well-attested, at least on this chart, is Homer's Iliad. We've got almost 650 documents. The earliest we found about 500 years after Homer actually wrote. We don't have Homer's original Iliad. These are all copies. So the point of antique literature is it's hard to have the original. And because we're talking over 2,000 years ago. But with the New Testament, total number of manuscripts we have, 24,000. This includes Latin and Syriac and Coptic. We have about 5,800 Greek manuscripts, which was the language the New Testament was written in. And they date within a few decades of the days of the things that happened in the New Testament. So an overwhelming number of manuscripts and a very close, at least compared to any other documents of antiquity, correlation between the time of the events and the documents that were written. When we talk about Greek New Testament documents, I thought I'd show you 3 different kinds. They kind of fall into categories. The oldest documents we have are papyrus documents. We don't have a lot of them. Papyrus was very fragile and it doesn't preserve well. What we have, most of them came from Egypt because the dry, arid climate and the library in Alexandria, which was a repository of a lot of ancient documents, that would be a natural place to find these. And so here's one of them. This is called Papyrus 46. It's also part of what's called the Chester Beatty Papyri. It's named after the guy who found a bunch of them. Hey, there I am. So Chester Beatty is Chester Beatty explorer. I'm gonna mute a couple of people here to make sure we're good. I need to be muted. Okay. Chester Beatty is the explorer that found them. This document is dated somewhere between 175 and 225 AD, so within 100-ish years. You can see though, you can see the fraying around the edges. You can see it's not a complete document. It's, we don't have any complete documents of the New Testament. We rarely have any complete documents of this kind of entire books. Some of the smaller ones, we have most of it. So you can see what it's looking. I want you to notice also the script here, the writing itself in Greek. One thing you may notice is that there are no spaces, right? No spaces. So they're also, well, that would be Hebrew Bible. So it's just letter after letter after letter. Why would you do that? Because writing material is at a premium. You just don't have a lot of papyrus laying around, I write something I don't like, I throw away that piece of paper and I got a ream around the corner I can get more of. That wasn't the case. So they're trying to conserve as much as space as possible. And this was one way they did. You can see they just kind of wrote all the way across. It's a long line of text, again, with no spacing. So that in and of itself, because we're a couple thousand years from, this isn't our language anymore. We know a lot about what was called Koine Greek that this was written in, but we don't speak that. We're not familiar with it. So just taking this and figuring out where one word ends and where another word begins is part of the challenge. Now, luckily, we have scholars that are really good at that and they know what they're doing. But I just want you to notice that. You'll see as we go through the different types of documents. So the oldest documents, and sometimes by that I mean scraps, are papyrus, and they're usually abbreviated with a P and then a number of that. Those are up to, from 1st century to about the 4th century, the date on that, because that would have been the time that was used. Now, the next development in writing was parchment, scraped animal skin. It's a little more durable. And so we have some Greek manuscripts that are on parchment. This is the document that's called Vaticanus, Codex Vaticanus. It's in the category of documents called uncials. And the reason it's called uncial is if you can see the script again, it's all caps, all capital letters, and they're about 1 inch high. Can't tell that, this is just a picture. But this word uncial has to do with the type of script and the size. Again, a little different, 2 columns. We've made a little bit of a different change here, but no spaces, all just bumped up together.
And this was still on papyrus.
No, this is parchment.
This is parchment. Okay.
This is parchment.
Which, can you describe parchment, please?
Scraped animal skin.
Yeah. It's not like cooking parchment paper.
No, it's
No.
animal.
Yeah, okay.
It would be a skin that's dried and scraped and then written on. So it's more durable.
Sure.
More durable.
But I thought that the parchment was previous to the papyrus and paper, obviously.
There might have been animal skins used for a variety of things, but
that was back in the first test.
in the early times, animal skin had a variety of uses.
Well,
So if it was between copying a document or warming yourself, you're probably going to say, I'm going to sweat in this bad boy. So,
absolutely. Okay. You answered the question.
So uncials are a category of manuscript that came after the papyri. They're about the 5th century to the 9th or 10th century AD is where we see a lot of them. We have a lot of them. 2 very important ones are Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. Codex Vaticanus is named Codex Vaticanus because can you guess where it's kept right now?
In
In the Vatican. That's where it's stored. Don't know where it was found. Codex Sinaiticus was called that because it was found at the base of Mount Sinai. These are nearly complete Bibles. In fact, Codex Vaticanus is almost the entire Bible, both Old and New Testament, which is pretty remarkable in Greek. And again, nearly complete. Let me give you the.
And that would have been completed in what year?
Well, it dates for around the mid-4th century.
So only 400 years after Christ died.
Correct.
They had a complete Bible that we're still looking at today.
Mhm.
Outstanding.
So
That's amazing.
It has 759 leaves, which are like pages. They're the sheets that are bound together. So that's pretty good. It is. So that's Vaticanus. Sinaiticus has 759 leaves. It only has half of the Old Testament, but all of the New Testament. Vaticanus is missing a few parts of the New Testament, but it has most of the Old Testament. So these 2 unsealed documents are hugely important in findings that allow us to see some of the earliest complete texts that we have would be these that are called unsealed. Let's see. There we go. The next category of texts are called minuscules, and that's because we go to small letters. These are a little bit later. This one is minuscule 481. It's dated to about the 10th century, so we're going, so you see the progression. Papyrus, the first 300 or 400 years, and then 400 or 500 years where unsealed manuscripts are kind of grouped together. And then the next period of time, these are called Manuncials. Again, one column, smaller letters, lowercase letters, and often ornate drawings on them. In fact, each one of the Gospels in this document has a picture drawn of the evangelist, the writer. This is the first, I think this is Luke. This page here is the first page of Luke chapter 1. So really fascinating. So we've gone from just a bunch of letters on parchment to begin to be decorated. You can see that there's a little more character to these. We have the most of these documents. Of the 5,800, about 2,800 are in this category, these Manuncials documents.
Again, that's parchment,
Yeah, animal skins.
right,
When you said they had a picture of it, how do they get a picture of the writer?
just drawing.
Drew a picture
Yeah, just like any artist, they decided this is what he looked like based upon maybe some traditional things that were out there. I should have put one of those up, but there's no text on the first page of the gospel with the picture. But you can look that up.
This is even.
Again, it's just guessing again.
Yeah, this is 1,000 years after Christ.
Yeah.
And they're still putting it on.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So there you go. So these are three categories of early documents of the New Testament we have. We also have some other places. The other category that I don't have any pictures of were lectionaries. Baptists don't use lectionaries, but if you're coming out of another tradition, a lectionary is a cyclical reading. It's not a text like Matthew 1 to Matthew 28. Certain weeks of the year have certain readings that are done in maybe traditional, and somebody like Doreen, was it Old Testament, New Testament, Gospel typically? And so a lectionary is a book that says on the first Sunday of whatever, you read this Old Testament, this New Testament, this Gospel. On the second Sunday, you read this. And so we have some old lectionaries in Greek that were being used in worship. Why would that be important? Well, because, again, documents, writing, the availability of these things are limited, but lectionaries would have been the closest some formal congregations would have had of copies of scripture that at least would inform their gatherings, their worship. And so they're
That's
sort
so
of,
you could study before you get there,
okay, supposedly. So rather than have, kind of like in the Old Testament, the synagogues or the temples would have arks with the copies of the books, the scrolls in them, but individuals wouldn't. So as we get to the New Testament, these are lectionaries, which aren't full copies, but they're working copies for the worship of the early church around these New Testament passages. There, if we're looking at like sources, we look at the first three, papyri, uncial, manuncial, as primary lectionary, because they're not organized exactly the same way like the scriptures. But they are Greek documents that we can compare. How does the text that they wrote, First Baptist Church of Jerusalem, because I'm sure there was one, compare to the uncial here? Is it the same Greek words? So we have these categories. Another category that's not used at all for textual criticism is early Christians. Early church fathers would write and they would quote passages from the New Testament. And so we have that to compare as well. But we don't use that for text criticism. We don't use that to try to find out what was the text, the original text of the New Testament. So interesting thing, of course, because you've got 58,000 or 5,800 copies, 24,000 copies. If you add the other languages in there, there are a lot of errors. And there is an interesting quote. There's a book called Misquoting Jesus, which is by Bart Ehrman. And he makes this point, and it's going to sound horrible. There are more textual variations in the New Testament than there are words. And he's right. There are about 400,000 textual variations among all of these documents. And there are only about 138,000 words in the New Testament. So almost 3 textual variants for every word. Now, the point of saying that, as you would guess by the title of his book, is he's trying to make the point, we don't know what Jesus said. We can't trust the New Testament text, because there's all of these variations in all of these documents. How in the world do we know what really was said, what Jesus really said, what really happened? Because there's all of these things. So we're going to spend the next few minutes debunking, if you will, that argument. Because, as I said last week, if we go back to that chart, which I'm not going to go back to, nobody here in modern society says we're not really sure what Caesar wrote. Because we only have a handful of documents and there might be some variety in their weight. Nobody argues that, right? Everybody just assumes we've got these documents, it's trustworthy. And yeah, there might be some variations, but what's the big deal? We only have 10 documents, right? The New Testament, just the sheer number of documents almost necessitates mistakes. Let me ask this question. Has anybody ever written something and misspelled a word? Anybody? Anybody at all?
Transposed letter.
Every day.
There you go.
I can't even say them right. Little spelling.
So we know, this isn't mass production. This isn't one copy that's proofed and edited and typeset and reproduced 1,000 times. This is human beings picking up some sort of writing utensil and copying from another document, sometimes by hand, sometimes by somebody reading it to them, depending on the situation. And so we know we human beings are prone to making mistakes. And when we talk about mistakes, or no, I'm not going to say textual variants in the New Testament, there are two main ways we consider them. And I said this last week, so this is a little review, and then we'll go into more detail. Variants can be considered meaningful variants. So I've got this unsealed manuscript that says this, and this unsealed manuscript that's a little different. And the difference really impacts what the text means. One of these is right, one of these is wrong, because they can't mean the same thing. So there's meaningful variants. If depending on how we look at these variants, it could very much affect what the text means. The second type of variant, and these are like not opposites, these are just two ways of classifying, are called viable variants. These are variants that have a high chance of actually being in the original, like in what Matthew actually wrote. This is a variant that likely could be original. And so you might look at a textual variant and say, okay, we've got this thing here. Wow, we've got two options, and there's good reason to think both of these could have been original. What are we going to do about that? Which one was original? Or we've got two options, and both of these are different in meaning. How do we know what was really there? That sounds bad, right? Considering I just said a minute ago, 400,000 variants. This looks like there's a lot of room for confusion. Like there's a lot of, we should maybe be careful about believing the Bible. Well, we take these two ideas and we begin to look at variants through that lens. And there are four categories that we can talk about with variants in the Greek text. The first category is there's a variant that's not meaningful and it's not viable, which means the difference between these two readings really doesn't change the meaning. And it's also this reading, there's no way it's original. There's just no way. It doesn't make sense. It wouldn't have been original. So obviously a variant, if I'm reading in this and this is the kind of variant, I can just dismiss that. It doesn't mean anything and it's likely not original. So I don't have to worry about it. On the other side, there are variants that are viable. Hey, this could be an original variant, but really it doesn't do anything to the meaning. I'm going to fill in more about this and give you some examples as we go. So just going to lay it out at first. So viable, but it doesn't change the meaning. Then there are variants that are meaningful. Yeah, this definitely changes the meaning, but when we look at it, there's no way it's original. There are easily explained ways of saying this isn't in Matthew's or Luke's or Paul's original letter. The only category that really should bother us are variants that are both meaningful, it affects the meaning, and they're both likely, both meaningful and viable. This is likely original, so is this. If this is original, then it's the opposite of this. So we really need to figure out what's going on here, or it contradicts, or in some way it's a meaningful variant. Now, any questions before I get into more?
Who's determined that? Who became determined all that at the time?
Well,
I'm just curious.
there's a discipline in biblical studies called textual criticism. And so these are principles that come out of that study. People that's what they do. They're archaeologists who go and take these old texts and look at them and compare them and try to discern. Ultimately, the goal is when in this case I have my Greek text here. Ultimately, when they publish a Greek New Testament, and this is an old edition, I think this is the 5th edition, and they're on the 28th edition now. So I'm a little behind. It's been a long time since seminary.
You're allowed. It's okay.
But when they publish this,
Right.
for those who can read it, that they want it to be accurate. And when they use this as the basis for your English translation, they want this to be as accurate as possible because the accuracy of this affects the accuracy, as it were.
They sort research and they study and
Correct.
they can, really take it into.
Right. So,
Well, my issue, since back to the question asked, was along with hers was the location of where the information came from. Not documented, I guess, but verified that it came from that time frame and was viable. And so you have, because you have the Holy Land, and then you have the Greeks who have a big play in this, obviously. And also, where does the papyrus come from? That comes from Northern Africa. And you have the different areas. Now, is that come into play?
it does a little bit.
Do they take a look at the geological origination of information?
To some degree, but you remember as the New Testament is forming, the church begins to expand
Mhm.
beyond the Holy Land.
Yes.
We're talking about Jesus's ministry, as Christie says, he never leaves 100-mile radius.
Right.
But with Paul, we've got him going all
They
sorts
go
of
as far as
places.
England and then all the way down to North Africa, where the
Right.
Romans did it.
So we've got a
So they were
spread.
there
So it's
before.
natural that as the movement of Christ and the church grows, these other churches in other places are going to want
Mhm.
a copy of. If Paul's sending a letter and I'm visiting the church at Corinth and they read a letter in service, I'm like, can I get a copy of that? Sure, and I'll wait around another week so you can copy it for me, and I'm going to take it back to my church in Asia Minor or in North Africa.
I'm sure the scribes were very busy in the early years. But I just was, as a question, can imagine that the original areas that this information came from in each area had to be verified.
There are, for instance, there's something called the Byzantine tradition of the text. There's something called the Alexandrian texts that show differences based on geography. But I'm not going to get into all that because it gets very
Well,
particular.
I can see where the variables would happen in the I don't have my glasses on, but the meaningful and the variable, viable and the meaningful.
Well, let's talk about these.
There would be
So you get an idea of why.
conflicts.
we
because
shouldn't-
of different areas that came from. The story would be told in a
Well,
different.
for instance, here's one conflict. I said this last week. Spelling errors
Well,
account
yeah.
for a large, not spelling differences, not errors, spelling differences
Right.
account for a large number of variants. For instance, if you're in America, and how do we spell color? C-O-L-O-R. If you're in England, how do you spell color?
There's a U in there.
C-O-L-O-U-R.
U.
Same word, same meaning.
Sure.
So not meaningful, which way you spell it. But both could be viable.
Mhm.
We're not sure. But it doesn't really, so if it's viable, yeah, they might have spelled color with this word or that word, but it's not meaningful. It doesn't affect the text and what's being said. And you're not going to notice that in your English translation. So there are spelling things that are there. One particular, like I'll give you a Greek spelling convention. It's called the movable nu. What's the movable nu? Best example, it's kind of like our indefinite article a or an. Sometimes you write a, sometimes you write an. Usually if a word starts with a vowel, you use an. If it doesn't, if it starts with a consonant, you use a. Does it change the meaning at all? No. In Greek, there's something called the nu. It's actually a V shape, but it's equivalent to our N that functions similarly. Sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. It depends upon what happens next in the sentence. And sometimes, as happens culturally, some people always use it and some people are more apt not to use it. And so the movable nu, it doesn't change anything at all about the meaning of the text, but it could be original. We don't know which one is original. So number one doesn't matter. We don't think it's viable and it doesn't have a meaning, so it doesn't matter. Viable but not meaningful is also not a problem. In fact, these two types of variants account for 75%. So 300 of the 400,000 textual variants are these. Totally meaningless. Another one is that comes out of here are transposing words. Sometimes the writer would say Jesus Christ, and another text would move it Christ Jesus, which was original. We're not sure. Both are possible. Does it change the meaning at all? No, it has nothing to do with the meaning of the text. So 300,000 of these variables are here. That's pretty remarkable. Meaningful but not viable. These are definitely problematic variants that dramatically change the meaning of the text, but there's no way one of them is original. So there's really not a question about which one it is. For instance, let me give you one that I forget which one I put on the stage. What's that?
Remember the one on adultery.
The one on adultery. That's an English translation. That's not Greek.
Oh, but that's kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah, like it's pretty meaningful.
Yeah,
Thou shalt commit adultery,
Yeah.
but there's no way that's what it means.
I know.
It's not viable. So good example.
Yeah,
Here's one. 1 Thessalonians 2:7. All right. I don't have the whole text on here in Greek, but there are three main variants that show up in this. Let me get there so I can read it to you. And hopefully you'll see through this process how this sort of thing works. So 1 Thessalonians 2:7, this is the NIV English version. Instead, we were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cares for her children. So typically, most translations go with gentle. Now, you might see the NIV has a footnote that says it. And the Greek word for gentle is here in red, epioie. Now, some translations say, and we were like young children among you.
Now that's the NIV.
The NIV does that. Okay, what's the difference?
One letter.
One letter. But you read this, and I don't know what most text critics say. Young children doesn't contextually make sense. We were like young children among you. And here's the thing. Here's the Greek phrase. What's the last letter here? N. What's the first letter here?
M.
N. Remember the documents? There's no space between words, right? So the scribe, in copying it, could have written this word, looked back, and repeated the N, written it twice instead of once, and now you've got a whole new word here. It's not a horrible idea. We're like little children. Could be related to gentle, but it's a different word, and there's an easy explanation how this word got here. Or if you prefer this reading, there's an easy explanation how this got here. They didn't write, there were two N's and he only wrote one. So, there you go. But here's the one that I like. Hippo. We were like horses among you. Does that make any sense? No. It doesn't make sense in context. It's only in 3 manuscripts that are very late as far as distance from the New Testament. And the general thinking is it's a very similar word. So Some say it could be from the oral scribing, one person's reading and the person writing misunderstood, although I would say, did you say horses? But nonetheless, or it could be an H becomes an N becomes an A, this is English. So this changes the meaning significantly, but it's not
That
viable.
makes sense.
It's just not viable.
It's a typo.
Right. So we can just throw that one out. It's not well attested in the documentary record. So we know it doesn't mean horses. So it's pretty meaningful, but there's no way we have to consider it. We might could debate these two a little bit, but this just doesn't even make sense. So meaningful, but not viable. Another one that is kind of interesting is one of the codexes, Luke 6:22. Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you and revile you and spurn your name as evil on account of the Son of Man.
Sounds like first and second grade to me.
So Luke 6:22. There's another variant that shows up in one document, Codex 2882, which says, blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you and revile you and spurn your name as evil. And it leaves out on account of the Son of Man. That's a pretty significant difference, right?
Yeah.
It's a meaningful change. Is Luke quoting Jesus saying, blessed are you when people hate you for no reason at all? Or is Jesus saying, blessed are you, this is Beatitudes, blessed are you when people hate you on account of your faith in Jesus? We would all say it's option one, not two. It's a meaningful change though, but it's not viable because like I said, it shows up in one document way later, very late document. It's in no other Greek text, right? Except that one. So you're like, okay, the preponderance of the evidence says something's going on here. One interesting thing that can happen in Greek text, and this is a fun word, is a homoateleton. How's that? Or how's a parablepsis? If you like that word, it's easier to spell. What does that mean? Let me go back a few slides to one of the texts. We'll go to the, so
If you did genealogy, you can see how these things can, where people write down.
oh yeah.
Just the names of the kids and ages.
So that's a good example, and it'll play into the parablepsis here. So Greek, like a lot of languages, English is a word order language. It's usually subject, verb, indirect object, object. You might have some modifiers, and there's a word order to our sentences, right? Greek doesn't follow the word order convention. In fact, it's often that depending on the emphasis, the verb could be the first word in Greek, and you could have the subject and the object and the indirect object all together in any order. The way you know what is the subject of a sentence in Greek, like some languages, is the ending that tells you. So agricola is a Greek word that means farmer. Agricola with an A, noun, nominative case, is a subject case. Agricola, agricolae, agricolorum, agricolam is the objective case. So that M ending tells you, so if you read in the sentence, you see agricolam, wait, that's an object case. That's in the predicate of the sentence. So it's got to be over here, not over here. It's not the subject. So endings. But the thing is, those conjunctions, a lot of nouns follow the same endings. So you're looking at this and you're on this line and you come to this letter right here, which you can't really see. And you write it down and you look back and that same letter is right here. So instead of going here, you jump down here, thinking you're at the same place, and you leave out all this stuff, like because of the Son of Man. So likely that one copyist looked down, wrote, looked back, and instead of adding that clause and that clause ended in the same letter, so he went in the same ending, so he went here and just kept writing. Okay, makes sense, right? I've done that. Reading. Have you ever done that reading? You're reading along, and maybe you're getting tired, and you come to the end of the line, and you're distracted. And when you come back, you're 3 lines there. Say, what? Oh, that doesn't make sense because that same word showed up. That same, it happens. It happens when you're copying text for hours and hours on end. And again, there's even a word for it, a parablupsis. So impress your friends later.
It's embarrassing, the music,
Oh, sure.
because here you are playing and singing along, and all of a sudden you look back, you might glance at your instrument, and you look back up there and you get the wrong place, and the music is, you're all screwed up.
Altered. I've done that. Where you get, the song
Funny
goes on.
to
like
say
that.
that.
Yeah.
I was thinking same thing to that happen.
Yeah, well, it
When I
does every
played
time.
ukulele, I was in the wrong line.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you
My
understand
eyes
what
were
happened.
in the wrong place.
Yeah, it's very easy to see that.
But the plodding along of the days and the months and the years to the scribes copying texts by hand, all these mistakes would come into play of just being part of the human condition.
And
We
then
don't
there's,
make
because they're
mistakes.
copying, let's say
Yeah.
I was the first one to copy Paul's letters to Colossians
Mhm.
and I made a mistake.
And then it would go down the
And
line.
then the next person gets my copy and they
Exactly.
copy it. But hopefully some of the right one gets copied too. We'll get to that.
Right. Exactly.
So meaningful but not viable,
Mm.
right? Things that would change.
Somebody read those. Somebody checked those, didn't they? I heard
Not
that they
necessarily.
did.
Maybe not. You
I
don't
heard
know.
that they did.
Proofreaders.
They were careful in how they went about doing things. Yes.
And I heard that they didn't make very mistakes, because when I was in the military and you went to type up a report for the military, you could make one mistake a page. If you had to erase anything else, you had to do the whole page over. Well, I heard that these manuscripts were like that. And if they found one mistake on there, that they had to do the whole page over.
So typically we talk about that with the Old Testament scribes.
Yeah.
There are seams in the scrolls, and if you made a mistake, you'd go back to the last seam and remove that and have to start over. We get to the New Testament, there's not a formal category of scribes whose job through the temple or through the king is to copy the text. These are people just wanting to get the word out.
Freelance.
And so some of those conventions, while we believe they were careful and wanted to do the very best they could with the text, there wasn't that same structure when we get to the early church. And part of it's because we've moved away from the concentration among a primarily Jewish temple-driven audience to geographically and ethnically some variety and some different conventions.
Spread out, start to spread out.
So
Yeah.
part of that fact, so yes, you're right. There is that reality to the text, but a little bit of that. And then the second thing we don't know is we have 58,000 Greek manuscripts. We believe that's a drop in the bucket
Oh,
of the ones that actually were out there if we were in the 1st or 2nd century. So we don't know how many other manuscripts that were really, really good, like the originals, were really out there. I'm guessing if 2,000 years later we have 58,000, what do you think there were?
Probably 4 to 5 times.
Just-
I thought,
yeah.
if not more originally, yeah.
You know, so there's a when you think about we don't know as they got winnowed down through history and decay and whatever how that process worked, and that complicates it. Well, we have with the Old Testament, for instance, the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed the fidelity of the copying process of the scribes. When we see much later, 2nd, 3rd century AD documents agreeing with ancient 400 or 500 BC documents, we're like, okay, they were really good at this. They were really careful about this. We don't have that same, at least we haven't yet come across that treasure trove of documents. Although in the last couple hundred years, we have made some pretty cool archaeological finds of text.
Well, the cultural world would have a play in that too, because these were written in the Holy Land area, the originals, not Paul's, but the others were written there, the Gospels. But say somebody over in Asia Minor is making a copy and they see something that said has no meaning to them, that was culturally correct for Judea, but it doesn't have any meaning, viable meaning to somewhere Ephesus or Thessalonica or wherever. So
Could
that would,
also-
those things could, because the guy that's copying it, or and they were mainly guys, but could, I mean, they may have talked about it among themselves and then decided to use a word that their culture would understand. Is that possible?
Well, as I said earlier to Todd's question, there are a couple of strains of text, like there's a Byzantine
Right.
kind of generation of text. There's an Alexandrian generation of New Testament Greek text that have some differences. So that kind of thing, we don't know how that happened, if it was culturally, if it was, there was a variant early that just somehow geographically went two different directions.
Well,
We
you
just
also have
don't
to realize there's wars going on.
There's a lot of
throughout
stuff.
the
There's
centuries.
persecutions of Christians, so
Yeah, and-
documents were destroyed.
Exactly. And you've got one government coming, or I'll call it a government, a conqueror, and literally burning, destroying
Sure.
the information of what they, just so they could change the culture of the people they just conquered. And that was practiced for the last 5,000 years.
Which is again why we have a treasure trove of documents, 5,800, but it's probably a drop in the bucket to what was
Well,
circulating
originally, exactly.
in the time. So let's go back to this and kind of get to the point. 400,000 variants. We can't trust the New Testament. The first two account for 75%. This third accounts for 24%. 75 plus 24 is
99.
99% of the variants in no way have any bearing on the text. The 1%, actually some estimate a little less than 1%, are meaningful and viable. So these are the ones that, let me show you one. If you have a copy of scripture, or you might have it if you go to John, chapter 8. Actually, it begins in 753. Most modern translations will have a note. This is the NIV. There's actually a line in the NIV, and then it says, the earliest manuscripts and many other witnesses do not have John 7:53 through 8:11. A few manuscripts include these verses wholly or in part after John 7:36. And what is that story? It's the account of the woman caught in adultery, that Jesus writing in the sand,
Right.
he was out stone or sin, throw the first stone. So this is a meaningful passage of scripture. And is it there or is it not? Because there's textual evidence that support both.
We're on John 8, you said?
Yeah, it's actually the first part, the woman caught in adultery.
Okay.
So I'll show you. I don't know if, here's how the NIV does. It writes the line, it puts this in italics,
Gotcha.
and then at the end has another line.
Okay.
So
Mhm.
that's one. That's a long section. I'm not going to go into what I think it should be there. I don't know of any translation that drops that out. The most it does is what the NIV does, is somehow note
Notes.
that in some early manuscripts it's not there. It's a great story, right? It shows part of Jesus's heart. So it's a meaningful story to the story of the New Testament, and there's some viability on either option. So those are the ones that you're like, what do we do with those? Another one is it's a one word thing. 1 John 1:4. This is another meaningful and viable variant. First John 1:4. We write this to make our joy complete. The NIV has a footnote, and if you go into the footnote, some manuscripts, your. So does it say, we write this to make our joy complete, or we write this to make your joy complete? That's a big difference. That's a meaningful difference. By the way, if you want some thought, there's one letter difference between you know, my and your.
Right.
It's a very small
Our-
difference in actually the writing of it. So it would be very easy to make a mistake, to miscopy. Because in your head, you look, and have you ever done that? You look at a word and it says this, and you write down another word and we go back and that's wrong.
What would happen if you meant both?
Yeah.
What's that?
What would happen if you meant both?
Then maybe that,
I mean, what would it change the meaning? I mean, wouldn't that be still viable?
we write this to make our and your joy complete.
Yeah,
I'm good with that. I think it works either way.
yeah, so that's not very meaningful then.
Well, it does change the meaning of the sentence if it's our or your. Like, it's our money or it's your money. Is that meaningful?
Yes.
There you go. Our and your is meaningful. You know,
But joy, I mean, you could say our joy is complete and, you know, yours is just left, you don't know if you're joyful or not,
right.
you know?
And here's the point I think you're trying to make, is it's the same point, and I saved this for this point. The guy who wrote the book, Misquoting Jesus, right, that said there are 400,000 variants, so you can't really trust. He said this, essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. So when we talk about variants, there's a lot of them, but that's because there's a lot of text. Most of them are meaningless, and even the ones that are meaningful, like this one, really doesn't affect the meaning of who Jesus is and what salvation is.
Right.
And it has no. So the bottom line is it's a fascinating area of study, but ultimately the study that's been done, including the archaeological evidence that's come along that's given us older and older manuscripts or scraps or documents, have only given us more confidence that what we have is pretty doggone close. We can't say it's exact because we don't have the original autograph, but we have a lot of confidence that what we read in our English translation of the Greek New Testament is the meaning that was intended and inspired by God through history. So then the question is, why do we have so many doggone different versions of the Bible? You ever thought that?
Mhm.
Good, let's talk about it. Because this is, so there are several translation theories. Translation, by definition, is interpretation. To take a document in one language and put it in another language involves interpretive decisions. Because words mean things, and sometimes they have an array of meaning. And so a translator has to look at this word in its context and determine the best word in another language that conveys the meaning intended there. And one word in Greek, if you look at a lexicon, could have a page worth of shades of meaning. And so they've got to translate a document involves interpretation. So we have all of these different versions of the Bible. And the reason is there are different ways of approaching translation. Two primary ones. One is called the formal or literal equivalence theory of translation. For some examples, the King James, the New American Standard, the Revised Standard, the New Revised Standard. This is what we would call a word for word equivalent translation. So these versions, what they try to do is take the Greek, and when it's Agricola, that means farmer, so they write down farmer. And when it's agape, that means love, and so they write down love. And whatever the word means, they want in your English reading to give you word for word what the Greek says. The negative is kind of twofold. One, it can feel wooden. It loses, from going from one language to another, loses the artistry, we might say, of a language. And to translate that directly can have at times a bit of an awkward or a wooden translation. And secondly, sometimes it doesn't show the idiomatic meaning of a language. Idioms, you know what those are.
Mhm.
I was trying to think of a good one, but I can't for the life of me. Think of one. Oh, I just said one for the life of me. If I don't think of one, am I going to die? No. Right? But you know what that means.
Right.
What's another one? I don't know. In a pig's eye. Or when
When pigs fly.
pigs fly. Yeah. What is that? That means never. So every language has idiomatic meaning. So if you were, if I was translating when hell freezes over, if I was translating Doreen's when hell freezes over into Greek and I was doing formal or literal, I would say, what's the Greek word for when? And I'd write it down. What's the Greek word for hell? I'd write it down. What's the Greek word for freezes? I'd write it down. What's the Greek word for over? I'd write it down. So I'd have when hell freezes over, word for word, formal equivalence. That's what happens in these kinds of translations. They're trying to say, hey, the words are important. One of the ideas behind this is something called the plenary verbal inspiration of Scripture. Plenary means all, verbal means words. So the idea behind that, and this is what I would subscribe to, is every word in the Bible is put there on purpose. The words matter. And so to be faithful to the words is most important in this. Now, another type is called a dynamic equivalent translation. A couple of examples, the NIV, the New Living, or the Contemporary English Version. There are more, but these are just some of the more well-known ones. Dynamic equivalent, for instance, when hell freezes over, if I'm doing that and I'm doing a dynamic equivalence, I just write never. One word, because that's what it means.
Yeah.
And if I'm from a different language, a different culture, a different era, when hell freezes over might not mean anything to me, but never means a lot to me. So an example, Exodus 15:25. Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood, and he threw it in the water. So this is when the water becomes undrinkable. If you drink the water, you're going to die. It's bitter. And so Moses cried out to the Lord. He wants God to give him deliverance from the bad water. And the Lord showed him, put a piece of wood in the water. He throws a piece of wood in the water, and the water became drinkable. Sweet is the formal, that's what the word is. The word is sweet. Does that mean God added sugar? That maybe that was a stevia stick? I don't know. Probably not. A dynamic equivalent says fit to drink, right? There's a difference there. The NAS is very much, the word says sweet, I'm going to write sweet in English. That's what that word means. The NIV translation says we want to understand what that idiom means. What does sweet water mean? Well, it means you can drink it now. You couldn't drink it before. That's the difference between them. A couple of other kind of examples just for fun. Because
I
I
can
wrote
see that happening all throughout.
Wow.
literal
Yeah.
translation of John 3:16. This is Young's literal translation. This is word for word. For God did so love the world that his son, the only begotten, he gave, that everyone who is believing in him may not perish, but have life age during. The literal translation, taking the words and literally translating. The New King James, a formal equivalence. So this is a little less literal. This is trying to smooth over the woodenness of a literal translation. For God so loved the world, you might know this one, that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believe in him should not perish but have everlasting life. We probably memorized it that way. The New Living translation, for this is how God loved the world. He gave his one and only son, so that everyone who believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. So similar, but you can see there's just a different way of approaching the Greek text to put it into English. Psalm 23, verse 1, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. You take that and you put it in the dynamic equivalence. The Lord is my shepherd, I have everything I need. The meaning is similar, but it's a different way. Right, well, it's not as familiar for sure, right? And so there's that. There's a couple of other translation theories.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I know. I'm almost done. These are the two main ones are formal and dynamic equivalents. They're also paraphrases. A paraphrase, the important difference of that, the Living Bible is kind of an older, the New Living translation is a translation. The original Living Bible was a paraphrase. A more modern one, the Message, is a paraphrase doesn't start with Greek. It starts with English. It takes an English text like the King James or the NIV and puts it in other words, other English words to try to clarify the meaning. Paraphrases are not translations. They can be helpful, but I would encourage you never use that as their main study or reading Bible. Have it, read it. Eugene Peterson's The Message at times the way it's organized and put together has some cool parts to it. But it shouldn't be like the one I'm always reading and always
Is
studying.
that like the Amplified Bible?
The Amplified is,
I find that I can't study with that.
the Amplified Bible is a little different. It takes, what it does is it'll take a Greek word that has several meanings and it'll list all three meanings,
Mhm.
and usually in parentheses.
Yep.
We'll take the traditional translation and then it'll have a couple other words that could also be like. So it's not really a paraphrase, but it's not exactly a translation either.
I just looked up John 3:16 in the Message, and it says, "This is how much God loved the world. He gave his son, his one and only son, and this is why, so that no one need to be destroyed. By believing in him, anyone can have a whole and lasting life."
So there you go, much different.
That's,
and-
that's the Message.
But again, that started with the English and
Uh-huh.
gave you more English, not a translation.
Right.
And then this is a new category. Some people are, I don't know if I like this. This is kind of a new designation. They're calling it optimal equivalence. They're not proud at all, right? We're the best. That's a very subjective point to name a translation theory, but that's what it's called. The NET Bible, the Christian Standard Bible, the New Century Bible, it's a mix that where they can be a formal word for word translation, they are, but they'll also opt for the more dynamic translation when that comes up. So it's kind of a mix. I don't like the word optimal. That's what they call themselves, not what I'm calling it, just to be clear. Trying to toe the line between them. So part of the reason we have a lot of versions is because there's different ways of looking at it. And so a different way of translating. Again, the point of a lot of this time we spent tonight, particularly on the variants, because that's something that has been used to say to Christians, you can't really believe the text of the New Testament, is all of that. When you get to the actual reality of the text, yeah, there's a lot of variants, but A, there's a lot of documents, much more so than any other thing of antiquity. And B, most of them are totally meaningless. They have no impact on the meaning of the text, or if they do, we know they're not original, so they don't really matter. And the few that do never change any major doctrinal teaching of the Bible. I know there is a strain of Christianity that, for instance, believes that there's only one translation you should ever use, the King James Version.
In Georgia, the church I was in, they only do King James.
And there are churches that do that.
Never read King James.
The King James Version is a wonderful
I
translation
love
of the
New
Bible.
King James. It's good.
I could say a lot, trying to measure. There are some differences. Like usually if you have a discussion with people that are King James only, it goes back to these variants that are in there. I can point out some places. One that you probably will be aware of is if you look at the Lord's Prayer in some of the more modern translations, "For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever," is often in a footnote, not in the text.
Right.
That's a significant change, and it's a manuscript thing.
And the Lord's Prayer is different in the Bible than it is in the Catechism.
Okay.
Yeah, I
didn't
was
know
gonna
that.
ask about the Catholic Bible. You didn't mention the Catholic Bible. And then there's the Jehovah's Witnesses, is Change the Bible.
No, the Catholic Bible has the Lord's Prayer in it.
Well, I didn't say that. I just
Oh.
wondered about, there's some differences in the Catholic Bible than there is in the.
So I think one of the big differences is some books that are in the Catholic Bible that aren't in the Protestant Bible. And that's going to go to the intertestamental period, which is our next class
Oh, okay.
lecture. So I'm going to pick up that apocryphal section and talk about that specifically. But Matthew in the Catholic Bible is Matthew in the English Bible.
Yeah, okay,
It's the same. Jehovah's Witness is different.
yeah,
They have changed parts of the Greek text or tried to explain it. For instance, the one that is the most probably well known is John 1:1. The
Right,
Jehovah's Witness translation says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God, a little g God." And the typical translation reads, "And the Word was God."
Right.
And so their belief is that Jesus was not divine. He was created. He and Satan are brothers. It's a whole weird thing that they do.
I know, that's what I'm saying.
But that's corruption on their part.
Yes.
The Book of Mormon's a different thing because he claims he got it wholesale out of heaven and got some special glasses to read it. And there's whole parts of the
They
Book of
can't
Mormon
find it.
that are word for word right out of the King James Bible, which is kind of suspect, but nonetheless. But the Jehovah's Witness Bible is just choosing translations that are wrong
I know.
and trying to justify their doctrine.
Right, exactly.
I think that the King James Bible was the way people used to talk.
Yes,
And we don't talk that way anymore, so
That was the way it
it's harder for me to understand it when I'm trying to beats and vowels. And, you know, when I was a kid,
Well,
especially, it was
sometimes-
The New King James doesn't read like that.
sometimes we say that we look at Bibles on reading level.
Yeah.
And the King James is a first year college reading level because of the 1600s language.
Mhm.
And like some of the modern translations are 6th, 7th, 8th grade reading level. It's a little easier to understand,
down.
partly
I
because
agree.
they speak a modern language that you and I are used to.
Mhm.
What do you do with like, why does the Lord's Prayer thing there? Well, one of the things that a King James only church would say is you're taking part of the Jesus's words out of the Bible. And my counter to that is, yes, if you want to look at it that way, one of the reasons that is a footnote is because we have found that's based on a 1500s text. And we found a lot more documents of the New Testament. So we have more archaeological evidence to inform us about some of these textual decisions we make. And what we find is that shows up later. It's not in the earliest. In fact, like the story in John, I think it's fine, by the way. When I say the Lord's Prayer, you know how I end it? For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. And I don't stop and say, the NIV says stop here. So I'm like, no, it's nonsense. That's how I learned it. And it's insignificant because that phrase, thine is the kingdom, power, and glory forever, that's not the only place in the Bible that we learn that.
Right.
It reinforces teaching elsewhere that God is king and he has power. So ultimately, is it meaningful? Yeah, it changes the reading of the text. Is it viable? Yeah, there's a lot of copies that have that. So say it if you want. I'll keep saying it. Most people will keep saying it, even people that want to look at text criticism, because it's not against the witness of the greater part of Scripture. But losing it doesn't negate the greater part of Scripture either. And back to the guy that tries to write the book saying you're misquoting Jesus, what does he say? Ultimately, none of these variants really matter. It all says the same thing, ultimately. There's more behind the King James only idea, but I've bored you enough with those pedantic specifics of how that works. If you want to learn more, just read about what's called the Textus Receptus, which is the idea that even though we don't have the original autographs, that God has preserved one perfect copy of the Greek New Testament. And that's the one perfect copy is the perfect copy the King James was translated from. That's behind the idea that you should only use the King James. Now, real quick criticism. There are parts of the King James that are translated not from the Textus Receptus, but from the Latin Vulgate. Because when you compare, it doesn't say that, but the Vulgate says that 60 times. And over 170 times besides that, they use other Greek texts besides the quote Textus Receptus. And the Textus Receptus there's one that they say it is, but actually there are in documented history about 7 that have claimed to be the Textus Receptus. So the question is, which one is the text? So there's a lot of fluidity because there's a lot of discovery archaeologically of these documents. Ultimately, don't let it undermine your faith in the integrity of the Bible. It should only make us more certain that God in his wisdom and through the people of history has preserved for us his word that we can open and read and learn from. And I hope that makes sense. And I'm going to stop
Well,
talking.
I think it falls to the fact that the hand of God is on.
That's the point.
This is supposed to be-
Well said,
Super
Todd.
powerful.
You should have taught this class. We've been out 30 minutes ago.
No, you are doing an excellent job. Thank
Okay.
you. Well.
All right.
Good job. Thank you.
Well, I'm gonna, since we're 5 minutes
You're
after.
making this understanding,
Oh, that's,
where this is
I
very,
hope so.
very complicated material. You're doing a very good job.
I find it fascinating.
It's fascinating. Absolutely.
Next week is intertestamental period, apocrypha, some of that, which is also an interesting thing. What happened between Malachi and Matthew?
There you go.
Oh, okay.
And how does that inform how we look at
Thanks,
Matthew?
folks.